Great to see you again on Native American history. Start with the question, how can maps, climate, and alliances break any timetable of domination? Let's verify it through primary sources. January 1835, Fort King, Florida Territory. Dawn hangs over longleaf pines and palmetto as orders from Washington move down the frontier road. Removal is written into policy and ration rolls. Resistance gathers in council fires and in hammocks cut off by blackwater streams. Osceola stands at the center of that choice. He is a young Seminole war leader whose words travel fast through Mikasuki and Seminole towns. United States authority is represented by Indian Agent Wiley Thompson at Fort King and by regular officers supplied from Fort Brooke on Tampa Bay. Black allies live and fight alongside Seminole families because freedom depends on the swamps as much as on any treaty. The ground itself is a principal actor because distance is measured in fords and sloughs rather than miles on a map. The record of the next 3 years begins with a paper trail. Payne's Landing is signed in 1832, and a follow-on agreement is recorded at Fort Gibson in 1833. Federal officials treat the documents as binding. Many headmen reject that reading. Arguments turn to arrests and warnings at the fort gate in early 1835. Columns form to escort families west. War parties shadow the roads and count wagons. The scale looks uneven on paper. The United States can send regiments and militia and money. The Seminoles can gather perhaps 1,000 to 1,500 warriors at need, yet they hold the advantage of terrain and time. The central question is plain. How did Osceola use alliance politics and swamp geography to turn a short removal plan into a drawn-out war from 1835 to 1838? Why did that choice force the United States to build a chain of forts and still struggle to fix the fight on open ground? The answer lies in dates and places and orders read aloud at dawn, and in the way a leader matched words to country, until capture under truce removed his voice, but not the pattern he set. May 1830, Washington City. The Indian Removal Act becomes law. It authorizes treaties to exchange eastern homelands for lands west of the Mississippi River. In Florida Territory, the policy collides with a small but rooted Seminole and Mikasuki population whose fields, towns, and burial grounds sit in pine flats, hammocks, and river margins. Territorial expansion drives pressure from planters and land speculators around Tampa Bay, the St. Johns River, and the Alachua country. Federal planners assume a short administrative transfer. Local realities make that assumption fragile. May 1832, Payne's Landing, Florida Territory. A treaty is signed that sends a Seminole delegation to inspect western lands. March 1833, Fort Gibson, Indian Territory. A follow-on paper is recorded that federal agents later treat as binding consent to remove. Many headmen dispute both the procedure and the meaning. The diplomatic file now contains signatures, but consent on the ground is contested. Through 1834, the War Department directs the Florida agency to prepare for removal. Missionaries report tensions over schools and village attendance. Ration distribution becomes an instrument of policy. The agency links food to compliance and uses attendance lists to count families for embarkation. Winter 1834 to spring 1835. Fort King and Fort Brooke. Orders emphasize registration weapons control and movement scheduling. Territorial authorities warn of theft and raids on stock as fear rises on both sides. April 1835. Wiley Thompson bars Osceola from receiving rations after a heated exchange at Fort King and has him arrested and released. The act signals that dissenters can be seized at the gate. Summer 1835. The agency cuts rations to non-compliant towns and pushes for disarmament. Families face hunger during the planting cycle. Rumors spread that black allies will be seized and returned to slaveholders if they report to posts. The administrative logic of removal turns into a set of immediate triggers, arrests, ration leverage, and the threat of forced separations. Strategic objectives diverge early and remain constant. The United States seeks to execute removal within months, protect settler corridors, and hold costs low. The first phase relies on small garrisons at Fort King and Fort Brooke, and on militia call-ups to escort families to Tampa Bay embarkation points. The plan assumes cooperation from leading headmen. It assumes roads will hold, and that disease will not disrupt operations. The Seminole Coalition seeks to block removal, protect families and black allies, and preserve autonomy inside terrain that slows regular formations. Leaders intend to avoid decisive battle-harassed posts and roads, and stretch time until negotiations improve terms or the state tires of the expense. Constraints are structural. United States forces are numerous on paper but dispersed in practice. Many regulars are new to the climate. Enlistments for volunteers are short. The theater is road poor and waterlogged in the wet season. Wagons bog on palmetto roots and in blackwater sloughs. Horses founder in swamps. Supply must move by sail into Tampa Bay and then overland by wagon and pack. Fevers and dysentery thin ranks during the heat. Seminole and Mikasuki fighters are fewer and must protect non-combatants. Powder and lead are finite and must be conserved or captured. Fields can be burned or abandoned only once before families face hunger. Intelligence risks are constant because informants can be turned by rations or threats. Logistics snapshots show how each side intends to fight. United States columns push depots forward from Tampa Bay, and the St. John's build small forts at river crossings and move with wagons of flour, salt, meat, and ammunition. Guides and interpreters become critical assets. The command tries to synchronize columns to close escape routes, but water levels and sickness break timetables. Seminole bands cache food in hammocks, use canoes on the Withlacoochee and Kissimmee systems, and carry light loads to maintain speed. They settle near water and timber to control visibility and retreat routes. Cattle and cornfields supply villages, and raiding replaces shortages when pressure is high. Communication runs by runners between towns and by councils set back from posts. Late 1835, the temperature rises. Newspaper pieces from the southeast insist that removal must proceed. Territorial settlers arm and press for patrols. The agency reads names from lists and orders families to muster. Headmen answer that the treaties were misread and that Western lands do not match promises. Each arrest threat hardens resistance. Each ration cut deepens the belief that reporting to forts will lead to seizure or separation. Columns begin to drill on the Fort Brooke parade with guides hired to open the road to Fort King. War parties shadow the trace watch for routine and test pickets. The immediate outcome of the buildup is predictable in hindsight. By December 1835, both sides have objectives, constraints, and supply paths that cannot be reconciled by more meetings at the fort gate. The United States has paper posts and a schedule. The Seminoles have ground time and a plan to break the schedule. The first volleys on the Fort Brooke to Fort King Road and the killing of the agent outside the stockade follow directly from that alignment of causes and pressures. The war does not erupt from a single spark. It arrives as an administrative plan that met organized refusal on terrain built to slow the plan down. January 1835 to December 1835. Fort King and Fort Brooke, Florida Territory. The dry season runs cool and clear across Palmetto Flats. Couriers ride between the stockades because there is no telegraph. Lists of families to be removed are read at Fort King. Disputes over the meaning of Payne's Landing and Fort Gibson harden into watch lists and arrests. On December 28th, a column under Major Francis Dade moves north from Fort Brooke toward Fort King. The file stretches in single rank between longleaf pines. Shots crack from unseen positions. Officers try to dress the line in brush that sits waist high. The column is destroyed in place in less than a day. The same afternoon shots ring out near Fort King as Indian Agent Wiley Thompson walks beyond the walls. He and several companions fall within sight of the stockade. Express riders push south to Tampa Bay and east toward the St. John's with the news. Militia musters form in frontier settlements. Cattle are driven behind pickets. Families pull back toward posts or cross the St. John's to safer ground. The Army orders more rations and ammunition forward from Tampa Bay. Every wagon now needs an escort. Every escort thins a garrison. The war acquires a logistics problem on its first day. December 1835 to January 1836. Withlacoochee River, Florida Territory. The river runs dark and high under cold weather fronts. Brigadier General Duncan Clinch leads regulars and militia to force a crossing and strike villages thought to be concentrated in the bends. Heavy driftwood and steep banks funnel the approach. Guides point to fords that shift with the season. The first files enter the water and stall. Fire breaks from timber on the far side. Men cling to logs and scramble up sand and clay. Companies reform under fire and withdraw to the near bank by dusk. The action confirms a rule that will hold for years. Rivers and sloughs dictate the timetable more than orders do. Couriers move all night to carry reports to Fort King and Fort Brooke. Delays cascade. A scheduled escort to move families toward Tampa Bay is canceled to cover the crossing force on its return. Settlers read this as exposure and petition for more posts. Commanders request more boats, axes, and pioneers and ask for Creek auxiliaries who can trail bands into ground where horses cannot travel. June 1836. Micanopy and Fort Drane, Florida Territory. The wet season begins. Afternoon storms build and fall across the Alachua country. Roads turn to rutted clay. Regulars rotate between Fort Drane and Micanopy to keep fields and towns from being burned. Seminole and Mikasuki fighters probe pickets and strike at corn cribs and cattle pens within a few miles of the posts. Skirmishes develop in Pine Islands where water stands ankle deep. Signals are by bugle at the posts and by runners in the hammocks. Misread drum calls and soaked powder cost minutes that cannot be bought back. On June 9, a sharp action near Micanopy tests the perimeter. Companies push out and are checked in Palmetto. Losses are light, but the effect is not. Families from scattered farms move inside the post lines. The garrison now carries two burdens. It must guard supplies and maintain patrols. Sickness rises as heat and exposure mount. Returns show men fit for duty falling as fevers work through tents. The supply chain lengthens as wagons detour around flooded creeks. Requests for boats to run the St. John's increase. Command learns that each mile from a dock multiplies risk more than each additional company can reduce it. Autumn 1836. Wahoo, Swamp, Florida Territory. The waters recede enough to permit movement into heavy cypress and sawgrass. Columns push toward a cluster of towns protected by tangled ground west of the Withlacoochee. The target is not a fixed fortification. It is a set of field stock enclosures and canoe landings set back from open approach lines. Scouts lose the trace where cattle erase prints in wet sand. Volunteers ride the edges and dismount into knee-deep water. The Seminole Coalition fires and falls back along routes marked long before the column arrived. The Army burns stored corn and drives off cattle to starve the defense. A week later, raiding parties cut 2 wagon trains and recover animals along another trace. The message is practical. A post can be struck by day and a train can be hit by night without breaking into a set piece. The campaign writes a ledger of burned provisions and lost mobility. The agency at Fort King notes that families who once reported for rations now avoid the lists. The staff discovers that an administrative tool can lose power once the promise of safety withers. Late 1836 to early 1837, command passes to Major General Thomas Jesup. The plan changes shape. He proposes to divide the theater into zones to fix bands by constant pressure and to pair parlays with converging columns. Interpreters are tasked to bring in headmen under flags of truce while Creek auxiliaries scout trails. The season turns cooler and marches lengthen. Messages now travel by a mix of mounted courier canoe along the St. John's and coasting schooners into Tampa Bay. Delays of days create mismatched rendezvous. One column waits at a ford that is passable only 3 hours a day. Another column misses the window and finds churned mud and empty cooking fires. Jesup's letters record frustration with timing and praise for small unit leaders who adapt to water first and road second. The build of small forts accelerates. Fort Foster goes up on the Hillsborough. Fort Mellon anchors the upper St. John's. Each stockade shortens one leg of a route and creates another point to defend. October 1837, near Fort Peyton, Florida Territory. Negotiations continue under white flags. Osceola arrives to speak in council. Jesup orders his seizure at the meeting ground. The arrest is conducted without gunfire, and the news runs fast by courier to St. Augustine and to posts inland. The immediate effects are divided. One group of families comes in under rations and guard. Another group slips away to the south and west, into the Big Cypress and toward the lakes. Leaders in the interior redefine councils with new voices. The agency counts the arrest as a success, but cannot claim closure. Scouts report that raiding parties have not diminished. The capture under truce alters the political balance and hardens suspicion. Interpreters now face silence at village edges where they had once been heard. December 25, 1837, near Lake Okeechobee, Florida Territory. The dry season opens a path across sawgrass and shallow water. Colonel Zachary Taylor leads regulars and volunteers south to force an engagement on Christmas Day. The approach is slow over ground that clutches at boots and drags at horses. The Seminole line waits behind a front of grass and shallow ponds. Fire opens and the advance stalls and then resumes by short rushes. Casualties are heavy. The firing line is taken by pressure. The defenders withdraw in order into Cypress where pursuit fails. Reports go out the next day by courier in 2 directions. One set claims a field held. Another notes that prisoners are few and that the same problem remains. The river mouths and the Everglades still give every band a path out of a trap. Zachary Taylor official report near Lake Okeechobee, December 26, 1837. We advanced in water and mud for a considerable distance under a steady fire drove the enemy from his cover and held the ground at night. The enemy retired in good order. The nature of the country rendered pursuit impracticable. The winter that follows shows the pressure rising on both sides. The Army reinforces the post chain, brings more boats into the interior rivers, and contracts guides who can run sloughs by moonlight. Seminole and Mikasuki bands break larger towns into smaller camps and shift caches deeper into hammocks. Families disappear behind curtains of cypress and appear only to plant or to cut a herd from a settler range. Each success in the open costs the United States time and health to exploit. Each arrest on a parade ground costs the Seminoles a leading voice but strengthens the belief that parley cannot be trusted. The courier routes are longer than any line drawn on a staff map. The season and the water still choose the hour of every fight. January 1837 to January 1838. The campaign shifts from scattered blows to a theater plan that tries to pin bands in place and drain their room to maneuver. Major General Thomas Jesup divides Florida into zones, couples negotiation with movement, and issues arrest and removal instructions to the agency and posts. Regular infantry, mounted volunteers, and Creek auxiliaries are assigned to converging columns. Depot boats build a lifeline along the St. Johns and up the Hillsborough. Small stockades multiply at river crossings, ferry points, and hammock edges. The aim is simple on paper and hard in water, and grass fix, close and compel embarkation. The order of battle for the decisive winter lists familiar units. Detachments of 1st Infantry, 4th Infantry, and 6th Infantry rotate through Fort Mellon and Fort Brooke. Volunteer battalions from Missouri and other territories arrive lean on drill, but strong on horses and local endurance. Creek auxiliaries recruited for scouting and trail work move ahead of columns and show where a canoe track becomes a footpath and where a footpath becomes a village lane. Command posts at Fort King and St. Augustine pass orders through interpreters and couriers. There is no telegraph. A hard rain can turn an order into a rumor before it reaches a rendezvous. The arrest policy takes final shape in early October. Jesup authorizes seizure of principal leaders if they present themselves under flags of truce and refuse removal. The instruction is brief, written for effect and deniability, and aligned to Washington's impatience with a drawn-out war. The agency directs interpreters to carry messages to councils near Fort Peyton. On the appointed day, Osceola enters the meeting ground to speak. The arrest party moves without gunfire, and the column returns to St. Augustine by road. Word spreads faster than wagons. Families who plan to talk at posts withdraw into hammocks or south along watery corridors toward the Big Cypress. Others come in to secure rations and relative safety under guard. The capture shifts the political geometry. It removes a persuasive voice but proves to every town that parley might end in irons. Thomas Jesup order extract headquarters, St. Augustine, October 1837. The chiefs who continue hostile must be secured. The combat path turns next to the interior lakes. December 1837 opens a narrow window when water levels fall enough to let a heavy column move. Colonel Zachary Taylor receives authority to push south from posts along the Kissimmee toward a reported concentration near Lake Okeechobee. The march runs across sawgrass plains punctuated by tree islands and shallow ponds. Wagons creak and stall. Men unload to push wheels through mud that grips to the knee. Crossing points become choke points where a single broken axle can delay a regiment and where a musket cart that turns over soaks cartridges meant for the next engagement. Guides point to firmer paths along slough margins and warn of sudden holes where water hides depth. Christmas Day, 1837. First contact arrives as a line of fire flashing from behind a front of grass and water. Taylor forms companies of 1st, 4th, and 6th Infantry in a broad advance with volunteers echeloned and orders the push by short rushes. The ground absorbs stamina and time. Firing is close. Officers stand to keep files moving through waist-deep water. Casualties mount, and the line steadies and crawls forward until the Seminole position yields. The defenders fall back in order to cypress cover. The field remains in United States hands at dusk, with dead and wounded collected and posted returns written by lantern light. Official figures record 26 killed and more than 100 wounded on the United States side. Seminole losses are harder to fix. Some reports claim a handful of dead and wounded, others more, but all accounts agree that few prisoners were taken and that organized pursuit failed in the ground beyond the firing line. Zachary Taylor after action near Lake Okeechobee, December 26, 1837. We drove the enemy from his cover and held the ground. The nature of the country rendered pursuit impracticable. Non-combatants bear the weight behind the lines that reports cannot conceal. Families crowd inside post perimeters for rations and are counted and guarded for removal by water from Tampa Bay. Smallpox scares run through camps. Fevers and dysentery take men as steadily as skirmishes do. Black allies tied to Seminole bands remain prime targets for seizure by patrols under territorial warrants, and rumors of captured detachments near posts drive more people into the interior. On the Seminole side, women and children move with towns split into small camps to reduce risk. Caches of corn and dried fish are pushed farther into tree islands, and canoes are hidden under brush along sloughs. Every mile that the United States extends its line demands another ration wagon, another boat crew, and another garrison to protect the new hinge in the chain. The legal and policy track continues in parallel, and often at cross purposes with the march tables. Agency clerks keep lists of those who reported and those who did not. District commanders issue standing rules of engagement that authorize seizure of armed males near posts and seizure of identified leaders wherever found. Volunteer companies sometimes read those rules broadly. Interpreters who carried white flags in 1836 now meet silence at village edges. At St. Augustine, the old stone fort holds prisoners of rank. Among them is Withlacoochee, known as Wild Cat, taken earlier under administrative detention. In November 1837, he squeezes through an embrasure and drops to freedom at night, an escape later retold with flourishes that become folklore. The undisputed fact is the escape and his reappearance in the interior. The disputed embellishments concern food fasting and secreted rope. The effect is immediate. Bands who hesitate between coming in and staying out hear that a leader has returned and choose dispersal for another season. The vote of confidence in encirclement comes at the cove of the Withlacoochee and Wahoo Swamp, where converging columns are supposed to close pockets. Maps show tidy arrows. The ground insists on limits. Creek auxiliaries find trails but cannot turn the water to road. Volunteers ride fast on Pine Islands and stop cold at Blackwater. Regulars push forward posts like Fort Foster to tighten the net, yet each new post is a mouth to feed and a target to cover. When villages are found, they are rarely surprised in mass. Fires still smolder and corn still stands, but the people are already gone, moving along pre-marked routes that cross and recross where maps show blank. Casualty accounting keeps pace with sickness reports rather than with large battles. The months around Okeechobee show scattered deaths and skirmishes and more names struck from returns for fever and exposure. Officers who report numbers to Jesup underline the arithmetic that matters. Men fit for duty today may be in the hospital tomorrow and discharged next week. Horses lost to founder and mired wagons mean fewer patrols and thinner escorts. The command answers by shifting more weight to boats on the St. John's and hauling more supplies by water to shorten overland hauls. That change helps some routes and leaves others just as long. The Everglades remains a country that swallows columns whole unless they are cut to canoe size. Arrest and transport procedures are standardized as the winter ends. Families who agree to removal are marched under guard to Tampa Bay. Embarkations move by schedule and weather rather than by proclamation. The humanitarian picture is mixed and recorded in brief agency notes instead of long reports. Rations are issued, medical checks are cursory, and separations occur when men are detained and families are moved. These are not battlefield casualties, but they are consequences of the campaign. The agency defends its process by pointing to orders and to the need to prevent escapes. Critics and newspapers question the seizure under truce and the treatment of prisoners. In the ranks, soldiers watch the embarkations as a sign that posts may soon be closed. In the hammocks, families watch the embarkations as proof that staying out is the only way to remain together. Fact and folklore part company at several points. Osceola's arrest under a white flag at Fort Peyton is documented in correspondence and press. The dispute lies in whether a promise was made and broken in the moment, or whether the seizure was understood, risk. Later stories add dialogue that cannot be sourced. His death at Fort Moultrie in January 1838 is recorded in post-returns. The exact medical cause varies by account between fever and throat infection. Withlacoochee's escape is certain. The dramatic flourishes about prolonged fasting are part of later retellings. On the tactical side, the numbers at Okeechobee are firm for United States losses and estimated for the defenders. Official returns give 26 killed and more than 100 wounded for the United States. Seminole losses range from a handful to a few dozen, depending on the report and later compilations. All sources agree prisoners were few and pursuit failed in the ground beyond the firing line. By the time word of Osceola's death reaches Florida posts in late January 1838, the campaign's logic is clear. Arrests under written authority remove leaders, but also remove the last trust in parleys. Battles won in the open consume men and time without yielding the captives a removal plan requires. Posts multiplied for control become liabilities to be fed and guarded. The map grows dense with arrows and still cannot force a decision in cypress and grass. Jesup continues to press to negotiate and to move depots forward, and the war continues to refuse a decisive end. The confrontation has produced its own stalemate engine. A policy designed for a season has created a geography of resistance that can run for years. January 1838, Fort Moultrie, South Carolina. News moves by courier back to Florida, posts that Osceola has died after months in confinement. The date fixes the end of one voice, but not the end of the war. The turning point has already formed across 3 places and 3 months: the arrest under truce near Fort Peyton in October 1837, the costly stand at Lake Okeechobee on December 25, 1837, and the winter that follows as families are marched to Tampa Bay while others vanish into the Big Cypress. Who acted where and when are clear. Major General Thomas Jesup authorized the seizure of principal leaders who refused removal and conducted it near Fort Peyton. Colonel Zachary Taylor forced a battle on sawgrass and water south of the Kissimmee chain. Garrison surgeons at Fort Moultrie recorded Osceola's death on January 30, 1838. Together, these events shifted initiative without resolving the policy that produced the war. Objectives and constraints shaped each step. Jesup's objective was to compress time, remove persuasive leaders from councils, combine negotiations with pressure, and produce embarkations before another summer of disease and cost. His constraint was the theater itself. There was no telegraph, only couriers and interpreters, and each delay opened space for bands to disperse. Taylor's objective was to break the pattern of dispersal by landing a decisive blow against a concentration in dry season ground. His constraint was the ground on the hour of contact. Ammunition had to be kept dry in waist-deep water. Volunteers flagged in mud. Wagons and litters bogged. On the Seminole side, the objective was unchanged from the spring of 1835: preserve families and autonomy by refusing set-piece traps, using swamp corridors to withdraw in order, and keeping black allies inside the shield of the hammocks. Their constraints were finite powder-scattered crops and a widening ring of posts that cut easy access to rations and trade. The immediate effects were unsentimental. The arrest near Fort Peyton removed a commanding voice and convinced many that parleys could not protect them. Some families came in to posts were counted on agency lists and moved under guard to Tampa Bay for embarkation west. Others broke councils and slid south. At Okeechobee, Taylor's line drove through fire and held the field at dusk, but the defenders retired in good order into Cypress, where pursuit failed. Returns show 26 killed and more than 100 wounded among United States forces. Seminole losses were lower and uncertain, and prisoners were few. The effect on initiative was paradoxical. The Army could claim field control for a day. The coalition kept strategic freedom for a season. Osceola's death the next month hardened both readings. It was closure for some newspapers and proof for many in the interior that only distance and water could guarantee survival. Zachary Taylor official report. Near Lake Okeechobee, December 26, 1837. We advanced in water and mud under a steady fire, drove the enemy from his cover, and held the ground at night. The enemy retired in good order. The nature of the country rendered pursuit impracticable. That line is an admission against interest. It concedes that tactical success did not yield the captives that a removal plan required. It also ties back to the structural forces that set the war in motion. Policy assumed roads and schedules. Geography denied both. Administration used rations as leverage. Resistance treated rations as a trap. Arrest authority produced short-term gains and long-term suspicion. Each lever pulled at Fort King or St. Augustine encountered the same friction measured in sloughs, sawgrass, and days lost to couriers and storms. The human cost is traceable name by name where records exist and by path where they do not. The Okeechobee returns list officers and enlisted men who fell, carried north by litter, or buried near water. Agency rolls show families delivered to Tampa Bay, boarded on schooners for Key West or New Orleans, and sent upriver to Fort Gibson in the Indian Territory. Those lines are thin in ink and heavy in consequence. Children who slept under palmetto now slept in barracks on a riverbank far from any cypress. Black families who had tied freedom to the hammocks faced seizure at posts or chose the deeper Everglades where patrols could not keep pace. For those who stayed out the displacement path, bent south across seasons, cornfields cut and replanted deeper in tree islands, cattle herds fragmented, and hidden caches of dried fish moved from one slough to another. If this winter were drawn as a winter count motif, the symbol would be a white flag beside a bound man at one edge and a ragged firing line in water at the other, joined by a dotted line of boats pushing through Cypress. 2 evidence-based counterfactuals show the limits of choice. If Osceola had not been seized at the truce ground in October 1837, negotiations might have continued long enough to split some bands toward removal over the winter. The arrest foreclosed that path and sent undecided families south. If Creek auxiliaries and northern columns had reached the Okeechobee approach line on the same day and hour, a partial encirclement was possible in dry ground. Staggered timings and the water's drag kept withdrawal routes open. Neither scenario changes the underlying arithmetic learned since 1835. Policy without secure lines and synchronized marches yields delay. Ground without decisive aims yields stalemate. The turning point, therefore, is not a single battle or a single death, but a convergence that clarified outcomes. Jesup's policy of seizure under truce proved that administrative tools would be used to end ambiguity. It also confirmed to those outside the posts that only distance and cover would preserve families. Taylor's advance proved that a determined line could drive a firing line from cover on a chosen day. It also showed that such days did not capture communities. Osceola's death ended one man's role. It also transferred initiative back to the map and the water. From February 1838 forward, the Army leaned harder into boat work on the St. John's, built yet more posts to shorten routes, and standardized arrest and embarkation procedures. The Seminole and Mikasuki coalition leaned harder into dispersal smaller camps and deeper caches. The initiative had shifted in a narrow administrative sense toward more embarkations, but the strategic problem that began with Payne's Landing and Fort Gibson remained intact. Removal could be enforced where roads and boats could reach. Beyond those lines, resistance remained a function of country and time. Synthesis ties this back to the causes laid down in the buildup. Federal law and treaties created a mandate to move people. Agency practice turned rations and lists into instruments. Logistics and climate defined what force could accomplish. The arrest near Fort Peyton and the fight at Okeechobee confirmed that no combination of orders and advance could produce a clean decision, while bands retained exit routes through water. The structural forces from 1835 policy pressed through thin administrative capacity into a terrain built to slow armies still governed outcomes in 1838. That is why the war did not end with a signature or a surrender after January. It continued as a seasonal contest between schedules and sloughs, between lists on a clerk's desk and families whose routes ran where maps showed blank. Spring 1838. Florida posts tighten their routines while the administrative machine shifts from battle returns to arrests, escorts, and embarkations. Families who accept removal are marched under guard to Tampa Bay, put aboard schooners for Key West or New Orleans, then carried by river to Fort Gibson in Indian Territory. Clerks compile lists of heads of household issue rations by weight and record transfers. Those who refuse fade south into Big Cypress and the Everglades and live beyond posts and schedules. The law is now a sequence of procedures more than a set of proclamations, and it runs for years. The legal track is visible in paper. War Department correspondence in 1838 and 1839 directs agents to standardize arrest and transport, to separate prisoners of rank from general parties, and to report monthly on embarkations from Tampa Bay and St. Mark's. Jesup's Florida letters record the policy of seizure of principal leaders and the reliance on Creek auxiliaries to locate camps. Zachary Taylor's official report after Okeechobee closes the combat ledger for that year and passes the theater back to escorts and surveys. Fort Moultrie post returns for January 1838 record. Osceola's death and the disposition of other prisoners moved north. John T. Sprague's 1848 narrative compiles many of these documents and counts the cost and tempos of removal through 1842 when operations taper and the Third Seminole War later reopens the cycle. Congressional serial set appropriations in the late 1830s and early 1840s detailed the mounting expense and the transfer of responsibility between line and staff as the war shifts from columns to logistics. Reservation lines come much later in Florida. Through the mid-19th century, the people who remain live outside fixed boundaries and scattered camps on higher ground within Big Cypress and along sloughs west of the Atlantic coastal ridge. In the Indian Territory, the Seminole Nation holds a defined domain by treaty. The 19th century allotment era later breaks that land into individual patents and open surplus to non-tribal buyers, setting off familiar pressures on land and grazing rights. In Florida, the 20th century produces recognized reservations at Big Cypress, Brighton, and what becomes Hollywood, followed by trust parcels at Immokalee and Tampa. Agency rules that once controlled rations now govern schooling, health clinics, and road access. In Oklahoma, the Mikasuki Academy and other mission schools operate under Bureau of Indian Affairs supervision. In Florida, day schools and boarding placements pull children toward English and away from Seminole Creek and Mikasuki. Bureau reports from 1900 to 1930 note attendance numbers, vaccination drives, and the slow shift from hunting and garden plots toward wage work and cattle. Resource use tracks with access. The cattle economy that Seminoles rebuild in South Florida grows across the 20th century and becomes both food base and revenue, anchored by grazing leases negotiated with county and state offices. Water control projects reshape the Everglades after 1900. Canals and levees alter seasonal movements, flood some camps, drain others, and push families to regroup on higher ground. Federal surveys and state drainage boards file reports that map new channels across routes once marked only by cypress stands. Rail spurs reach closer to former camp areas and change trade. By mid-century, trust lands and reservation hubs support stores, clinics, and later gaming enterprises under tribal ordinances and compacts, which bring funds into language and cultural programs. Demography and health swing with war and policy. Removal lists in 1838 through 1842 show thousands sent west. Estimates compiled by Sprague and by later historians place the total removed during the Second Seminole War on the order of several thousands, with a few hundred remaining in South Florida at mid-century. Post-returns and surgeons' reports record fevers and dysentery among troops and civilians during campaigns. War Department tables summarize mortuary spikes during wet seasons. In Indian Territory, 19th century censuses list Seminole towns and population counts that fluctuate with epidemic waves and allotment disruption. In Florida, early 20th century enumerations by agency staff show slow growth from small base numbers as families cluster near clinics and schools. Culture continues under pressure and adapts. The green corn ceremony remains a hinge in the year for families in Florida and in Oklahoma. Speech communities hold Seminole Creek and Mikasuki. Elders insist on use in council and ceremony, even as school rules favor English. Patchwork clothing becomes a marker of identity by the early 20th century and appears in photographs preserved by state archives and agency annual reports. Chickee architecture, palmetto-thatched, open-sided houses on raised platforms, persists in camps and later on reservations recorded in Works Progress Administration interviews and mid-century ethnography. Hunting and fishing continue along seasonal lines, but permits and wardens complicate movement. Game wardens' logs and county rules show the accretion of restrictions layered over older paths. Memory is kept in names and stories tied to places and in documents collected by others. Sprague's 1848 volume, Taylor's official report, Jesup's letters, and Fort Moultrie returns anchor the administrative story. Seminole oral histories and works, Progress Administration collections, add the ground-level view of camps' arrests and escapes. Later ledger-style drawings are not a dominant Seminole form as on the plains, but school notebooks and church program covers from the early 20th century carry hand-drawn scenes of canoes, chickees, and council fires that function as quiet records. Community commemorations in Florida mark the green corn each year and honor elders who held language and routes through the years when posts were far and roads were new. In Oklahoma, Seminole Nation pageants and cultural days keep town identities and ceremonial grounds active across the seasons. The present is shaped by that long ledger of policy and adaptation. Seminole Tribe of Florida maintains reservations at Big Cypress, Brighton, Hollywood, Immokalee, and Tampa, with programs for language revitalization, cattle operations, education, and health. Its constitution dates to mid-20th century federal recognition. Mikasuki, Tribe of Indians of Florida, holds lands west of Miami, maintains Mikasuki language programs, and engages in Everglades environmental negotiations. Seminole Nation of Oklahoma, centered at Wewoka, organizes around historic towns and ceremonial grounds, with language classes and cultural preservation offices that support Seminole Creek and traditions tied to green corn and stomp dances. All maintain tribal historic preservation offices that review development and consult on Everglades restoration or pipeline and highway projects that cross ancestral routes. Indian Claims Commission decisions in the 1970s recognized historic takings and distribution statutes. In the following decade, apportioned awards among Oklahoma and Florida groups. Tribal resolutions placed portions into trust and funded education and cultural programs rather than per capita windfalls. 5 records frame this aftermath. Sprague's Origin, Progress, and Conclusion of the Florida War assembles the administrative core and the removal lists. Jesup's correspondence in National Archives files preserves the seizure policy and the logic behind it. Taylor's Okeechobee report shows how a tactical hold did not produce strategic closure. Fort Moultrie post-returns fix the date and place of Osceola's death and track other prisoners' movements. Bureau of Indian Affairs, annual reports from 1900 to 1930, and the Congressional Serial Set capture the shift from removal to schooling, health, and reservation infrastructure. Indian Claims Commission dockets and the subsequent distribution statutes explain the 20th century legal resolution of 19th century takings. Together, these records show a system that tried to turn war into paperwork and a people who turned paperwork into space and time. The continuance is measured not by proclamations, but by the ordinary. Children speaking Mikasuki in homes on Big Cypress and Brighton. Seminole Creek prayed in Oklahoma at grounds that go quiet, only to open again each year. Cattle pushed across flatwoods that were once patrol routes. Canoes used for teaching rather than flight on a slough remembered for escapes. The memory of a rest under a white flag of a firing line in water and of a grave at Fort Moultrie is not a closing scene, but a chapter break. What began as removal extends into a present where law and land are still negotiated, and where ceremony and language mark continuity more powerfully than any boundary line on a map. Across the long arc of 19th century policy and resistance, the Florida War centered on Osceola yields a durable consensus. First, it demonstrates how a removal regime built on treaties, rations, and schedules faltered when pressed into a roadless theater where water and season set the hours of action. The state could escalate costs and build posts, but it could not force a clean decision while exit routes remained. Second, it shows that negotiation and coercion, when executed together, often produced opposite effects at the village edge. Seizures under truce removed leaders, yet hardened distrust and pushed undecided families deeper into the interior, prolonging the conflict rather than shortening it. Third, it confirms that small unit adaptation boats on Blackwater forts at crossing zone operations can win ground and produce embarkations without converting tactical success into strategic closure, where the political aim is total relocation of a civilian population. Key points remain contested. The meaning and consent of the Payne's Landing and Fort Gibson agreements divide interpreters, with some reading them as binding acceptance of Western lands and others as contingent inspection that agents later overreached. Strength and loss figures are debated. United States returns fix their own casualties precisely, while Seminole numbers and fatalities are estimated and vary by report. This affects judgments about Okeechobee's cost and value. Osceola's capture under a white flag is recorded. Whether it violated a specific promise at the moment or enforced an understood risk remains a moral and legal fault line in the literature. The role and numbers of black allies central in field practice and in removal fears are clearer in narrative than in rosters, and scholars differ on how fully their agency is represented in official sources versus oral accounts. The legacies extend beyond Florida. Doctrinally, the Army carried forward lessons in riverine movement, seasonal logistics, and fort chains that reappeared in later frontier theaters. The limits were as instructive as the successes. Administratively, the war accelerated patterns that defined the century. The turn from line operations to agency control, the standardization of arrest and transport procedures, and the substitution of schooling and clinics for rations as instruments of policy. Legally, 19th century takings fed 20th century claims and settlements that funded cultural and language programs in Oklahoma and Florida, tying archival paper to living institutions. Culturally, Osceola became a symbol of refusal and of the costs of refusal, a name invoked in art ceremony and community history, not as a solitary hero, but as a figure who stands for a coalition that matched words to country. The war also fixed the map the Everglades as a place of continuance for families who stayed in Indian territory, as the place where Seminole towns rebuilt under new pressures, each side of the map carrying forward language, ceremony, and law. The episode endures because it makes visible a structural truth that recurs across time when a government tries to turn a people into a timetable. Terrain alliances and memory turn the timetable back. From Jesup's files to Taylor's report, the story shows timetable cannot beat terrain and memory. Which topic should we explore next? Coacoochee's escape the fort chain or life after removal in Indian territory? Drop your suggestion below. Thank you for watching.